To the outside world, Charles Lindbergh's family life appeared almost perfect. After becoming the most famous man in America in 1927 for his daring solo flight across the Atlantic, Lindbergh married Anne Morrow, the thoughtful and literary daughter of a U.S. diplomat. She was not just his wife, but also his co-pilot, his partner in exploration, and the quiet counterbalance to his stoic, often cold personality. Together they seemed to embody the American dream: courage, intellect, and family values wrapped into one household. Yet beneath the carefully composed photographs and glowing news reports, the Lindbergh family story was marked by tragedy, resilience, and the constant pressure of fame. In 1930, Anne gave birth to their first child, Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr., nicknamed the Eaglet by the press. He was celebrated as the perfect heir to America's aviation hero. But in March 1932, that image of domestic bliss was shattered when the toddler was kidnapped from the family's New Jersey home. The crime became front-page news around the world, sparking a national frenzy that would later be called the crime of the century. After weeks of ransom notes and false leads, the boy's body was discovered not far from the house. He had been killed. The loss devastated the Lindberghs, leaving a permanent scar on their marriage and casting a long, dark shadow over the lives of their future children. Later that same year, Anne gave birth to John Lindbergh, who inherited his father's love of exploration, but found his passion in the sea rather than the sky. John became one of America's pioneering aquanauts, taking part in undersea missions like SeaLab during the 1960s. Despite his adventurous career, John preferred privacy and rarely spoke about his famous father. When he passed away in 2021 at the age of 88, he was remembered as a man of quiet strength who lived life on his own terms. In 1937, another son was born, Land Morrow Lindbergh. Unlike his brother, Land chose a life on solid ground, working as a rancher in the American West. He lived largely outside the spotlight, but carried with him the complicated inheritance of being Charles Lindbergh's son, a mixture of pride, pressure, and distance from the man who had inspired so many. The couple's first daughter, Anne Spencer Lindbergh, arrived in 1940. Creative and warm, she pursued art and teaching, cultivating a life defined more by compassion than by celebrity. But her story too ended tragically. Anne died of cancer in 1993 at the age of just 53, remembered by those who knew her as gentle and giving, qualities that contrasted sharply with her father's stern, often aloof demeanor. In 1942, Anne gave birth to another son, Scott. Like Land, Scott chose a life rooted in the land, becoming a rancher and later devoting himself to conservation efforts in Montana. He rarely spoke publicly, but when he did, he acknowledged the reality that his father had been more of an absent figure than a guiding one. For Scott, the Lindbergh name was less about fame and more about the solitude of open skies and wide fields. Finally, in 1945, the youngest of the American children was born, Reeve Lindbergh. Unlike her siblings, Reeve embraced a more public role, carving out her own identity as a writer. Through her books and memoirs, she reflected candidly on her family's story, the highs of her parents' accomplishments, the lows of the kidnapping tragedy, and later, the painful revelation of her father's secret European families. In many ways, Reeve became the voice of the American Lindbergh children, speaking openly about the legacy they inherited and the man they only partially understood. Together, the surviving 5 children of Anne and Charles Lindbergh grew up in a household unlike any other. Their lives were shaped by privilege, by loss, and by the towering presence of a father whose fame never truly faded. They lived under the glare of public scrutiny and under the weight of a name that symbolized triumph, tragedy, and controversy. For decades, they believed they were their father's only heirs. What they did not know, what no one in America knew, was that across the Atlantic, in post-war Germany, there were 7 more children carrying the same bloodline, waiting in secrecy for the truth to one day be revealed. For much of the American public, Charles Lindbergh was a symbol of discipline, honor, and the traditional family man. But in the 1950s, long after his famous flight and the kidnapping tragedy, he began leading a double life, one that went far beyond the quiet family he had in America. While traveling frequently to Europe for business, medical experiments, and political connections, Lindbergh established not 1, but 3 secret relationships with women in Germany. Out of these relationships came 7 children, hidden from the world and even from his American family. The first of these women was Brigitte Heschheimer, a Munich hatmaker who met Lindbergh in the 1950s. Unlike Anne Morrow Lindbergh, Brigitte was not from a wealthy or diplomatic background. She lived a modest life, far from the glamorous spotlight that surrounded Lindbergh in America. Their connection, however, was lasting. Over the years, Brigitte gave birth to 3 of his children: Dirk, born in 1938, Astrid, born in 1941, and David, born in 1967. These children grew up never fully understanding who their father really was. To them, he was known only as a mysterious American visitor, using the alias Caro Kent. He would arrive in Munich, spend time with them quietly, and then vanish again, sometimes for months at a time. But Brigitte was not the only Hersheimer sister Lindbergh grew close to. He also began a relationship with Marietta Hersheimer, Brigitte's younger sister. With her, he fathered 2 more sons, Vago, born in 1942, and Christoph, born in 1945. The relationships overlapped, a web of secrecy so carefully managed that even within the family, little was openly discussed. To the outside world, it appeared as though the Hersheimer sisters were simply raising children on their own. Behind closed doors, however, they were bound together by a shared secret and a shared loyalty to a man who demanded absolute silence. The third relationship was with Valeska, a German aristocrat who lived a more privileged life than the Hersheimer sisters. With her, Lindbergh had 2 additional children, a son and a daughter. Unlike the Hersheimer siblings, these children have remained almost entirely private, their names and lives shielded from the press. To this day, they are the most mysterious of the Lindbergh descendants, living out of the public eye with only fragments of their story known, all told. These 3 secret unions produced 7 children, bringing Lindbergh's total number of offspring to 11. Yet none of them grew up with a father in the ordinary sense. Instead, they knew him as a man who would arrive unannounced, spend brief but meaningful time with them, and then disappear without explanation. He gave them gifts, wrote them letters, and offered guidance in private moments. But he demanded secrecy. The children were instructed never to tell friends, never to speak openly, and never to question too deeply who he really was. To neighbors and schoolmates, he was simply a family friend, a foreigner who seemed oddly important, yet remained nameless. The secrecy was not just for convenience, it was survival. Lindbergh was still one of the most famous men in the world. If word had spread that the American hero, the symbol of traditional family values, was fathering children across Europe while still married to Anne Morrow Lindbergh in the United States, the scandal would have been explosive. And so for decades the truth remained hidden. Brigitte, Marietta and Valeska kept their silence, raising their children in quiet corners of Germany, while Lindbergh himself maintained the facade of a devoted husband and father back in America. What makes this double, or perhaps triple, life even more extraordinary is how meticulously Lindbergh managed it. He kept separate journals, separate schedules, and separate sets of correspondence. He traveled frequently between continents under the cover of business or health reasons, but in reality, much of that travel was devoted to maintaining these hidden relationships. Even his wife Anne, though she sensed her husband's distance and emotional coldness, never uncovered the full scope of what he was doing overseas. For the children in Germany, growing up with this hidden father was confusing. They knew him only in fragments, a kind visitor who sometimes played with them, a strict figure who demanded discipline, a man who seemed larger than life yet strangely absent. As they grew older, they began to piece together the truth. But for decades they held their silence, bound by a promise their mothers had made, and by a desire to avoid the scandal that would surely erupt if the world ever found out. And so, while the American Lindbergh children lived under the spotlight, constantly reminded of their father's fame and the kidnapping that defined their childhoods, the German children lived in the shadows. They were invisible to history, their existence unknown outside a small circle of family and neighbors. Charles Lindbergh had managed the impossible, to be both the most famous man in the world and at the same time the most secretive father. But secrets have a way of surfacing. Decades later, long after Lindbergh's death, the silence would be broken. The hidden families of Europe would step forward, and the world would finally learn the full scope of the aviator's secret life. For decades after Charles Lindbergh's death in 1974, the world believed his legacy was fully known. His triumph across the Atlantic, the tragedy of his kidnapped son, his controversial political views, his reclusive later years in Hawaii, these were the chapters historians thought had been written in full. But in truth, the final chapter of Lindbergh's life story remained hidden. locked away in the memories of women in Germany and the children they raised in silence. By the late 1990s, however, cracks began to appear in that carefully constructed secrecy. The Hersheimer children, now adults with families of their own, had quietly lived with their father's memory for decades. For them, the visits from the mysterious American, known only as Caro Kent, were both a gift and a burden. He had been affectionate, sometimes stern, always commanding, but never fully present. They had grown up knowing they were different, but without the public recognition or even the financial security that often comes with such a famous lineage. They were living with an unspoken truth, and the silence was beginning to weigh on them. The turning point came in 2003, nearly 30 years after Lindbergh's death. Astrid Hersheimer, the middle child of Brigitte's three, decided to step into the light. She revealed a collection of letters and diaries her mother had carefully preserved. These were no ordinary documents. They were handwritten notes from Charles Lindbergh himself, letters filled with affection, instructions, and coded references to his life in America. The handwriting matched, the dates aligned, and the tone was unmistakably his. Lindbergh had not been a mysterious friend of the family. He had been their father all along. The revelation hit the German press first, breaking as a headline story that rippled quickly across the globe. For many, it seemed unbelievable. How could the most famous man in the world have managed to keep 7 children hidden from history? But the letters were undeniable. They carried his distinctive script, his private thoughts, even references to his travels that lined up with known historical events. To remove any doubt, the family agreed to undergo DNA testing. The results confirmed what the letters had already suggested. Charles Lindbergh, America's aviation hero, had indeed fathered the Hersheimer children. The story that had been whispered about for decades was now a matter of scientific fact. The revelation sent shockwaves not only through Germany, but across the United States. Newspapers and television networks covered it with a mix of fascination and disbelief. Some called it one of the greatest hidden scandals of the 20th century. Others viewed it as a human story of loneliness, longing, and the complexities of a man who was never truly satisfied with one life. For the American Lindbergh family, the children Anne had raised with Charles, the news was nothing short of devastating. Reeve Lindbergh, the youngest daughter, later admitted that she learned of her father's double life from the newspapers, just like everyone else. In her writings, she described the pain and confusion of realizing that the man she had spent her life trying to understand had harbored not just secrets, but entire families she and her siblings never knew existed. She called the discovery like a second betrayal, a shattering of the fragile image of her father that had already been complicated by his politics and his emotional distance as a parent. For historians, the revelation forced a re-evaluation of Lindbergh's legacy. Here was a man who had achieved greatness in the skies, who had inspired millions, but who also lived a compartmentalized life filled with secrecy, control, and contradictions. His hidden families became as much a part of his story as his Atlantic flight, reshaping how the world remembered him. And for the European children themselves, the moment was bittersweet. On one hand, the truth was liberating. They no longer had to live in silence, no longer had to carry the weight of a secret that had defined their childhoods. On the other hand, the world now knew them not for who they were as individuals, but as the hidden heirs of a global icon. Overnight, they became symbols of a secret history that the world had never imagined. By 2003, the truth was undeniable. Charles Lindbergh, the man who had once seemed larger than life, was revealed to have been more human, more flawed, and far more complex than the heroic image America had built around him. The story that had been carefully concealed for half a century was finally out in the open. But the story did not end with the revelation. Now that the secret was known, the world wanted to understand more. Who were these hidden children? What lives had they built in the shadow of a man they could never fully claim? And how did their existence change the meaning of the Lindbergh legacy? Once the secret of Charles Lindbergh's European families became public, the world's fascination quickly turned to the children themselves. Who were they? What lives had they built while growing up in the shadow of a man who visited in secret, left without explanation, and demanded their silence? Each of them carried his legacy differently, some with pride, others with reluctance, and many with an unshakable desire for privacy. The eldest of Lindbergh's hidden children was Dirk Hersheimer. Born in 1938 to Brigitte in Munich, Dirk was artistic, thoughtful, and intensely private. He pursued a career as a teacher, and later became a painter. creating works that often reflected a quiet search for identity. Growing up, Dirk had only fragments of a father. Short visits, brief words of advice, and the unspoken understanding that he was connected to someone important. When the truth finally surfaced, Dirk acknowledged it but did not seek fame. He lived most of his life quietly in Germany, passing away in 2001, 2 years before the world learned the full truth. His death meant he never witnessed the public recognition of the secret he had carried for so long. Next was Astrid, born in 1941, also to Brigitte. Outgoing, creative, and strong-willed, Astrid became a sculptor, channeling her emotions and experiences into art. She was the sibling who eventually broke the family's silence, revealing her mother's letters and confirming Lindbergh's role in their lives. In interviews, she described the emotional burden of secrecy, the pain of being unable to speak openly, and the strange duality of having a father who was both affectionate and impossibly distant. For Astrid, speaking out was not about scandal. It was about reclaiming her own story. The youngest of Brigitte's children was David, born in 1967, decades after his half-siblings. Growing up in a different Germany, David pursued the sciences and built a professional life far removed from the headlines. Unlike Astrid, he has largely avoided the media, preferring to live outside the shadow of his father's legacy. To this day, he remains private, embodying the part of Lindbergh's hidden family that chooses silence over spotlight. Lindbergh's relationship with Brigitte's sister, Marietta Heschheimer, produced 2 more children. Vego, born in 1942, grew up during the final years of the Second World War. He later pursued a career in business, navigating adulthood without the benefit of a public name or acknowledgement. Like his siblings, he knew his father under an alias, a man who arrived with authority and affection but never with permanence. Vego, too, chose to remain largely out of the public eye after the story broke, allowing his sister Astrid to shoulder most of the public questions. Christoph, Marietta's youngest son, was born in 1945, just as the war ended. His earliest years were shaped by post-war Germany, a time of rebuilding and quiet resilience. He pursued work in finance, living an ordinary life in Munich that stood in stark contrast to the extraordinary circumstances of his birth. Christoph rarely speaks publicly, embodying the tension between a name known around the world and a personal story he has guarded carefully. The most enigmatic of Lindbergh's hidden children are those he fathered with Valeska, the German aristocrat. With her, Lindbergh had a son and a daughter, whose names and lives remain almost entirely unknown. Unlike the Heschheimer children, these siblings have remained completely private, never giving interviews and never stepping forward to claim a share of their father's public legacy. Their anonymity has only deepened the intrigue surrounding Lindbergh's secret life, leaving the world to wonder what they think of their famous father, and what lives they have chosen to lead away from public scrutiny. What unites all of these children is not just their bloodline, but the peculiar way they grew up. Knowing a father who was always present and absent at once, Lindbergh visited them, wrote to them, and made his influence felt. But he never lived as a full-time parent. He was a figure of authority, almost a legend within their own homes, but never a truly ordinary father. They grew up in the strange space between intimacy and distance, love and secrecy. After the truth emerged in 2003, the European children were suddenly thrust into the spotlight. Some, like Astrid, embraced the chance to speak. Others retreated even further into privacy, hoping to preserve the ordinary lives they had built for themselves. What was once a secret became a public legacy, and each child had to decide for themselves how much of it they wanted to carry. The American Lindbergh children, meanwhile, were forced to reckon with the reality of half-siblings they had never known. For them, it was as if their father's life had expanded overnight into something they could hardly recognize. For the European children, it was the opposite. The world finally recognized a truth they had lived with all along. Together, the hidden children paint a portrait not of scandal alone, but of human lives shaped by silence, secrecy, and the complicated affections of one of the 20th century's most famous men. They remind us that history's great figures are never just heroes or villains. They are human beings, whose private choices ripple through generations. When the story of Charles Lindbergh's secret families broke in 2003, it didn't just shock historians, it redefined how the world remembered him. For nearly a century, Lindbergh's name had been etched into American mythology. He was the lone pilot, the fearless adventurer, the man who conquered the Atlantic in a single daring flight. But beneath that legend lived a man whose personal life was marked by contradictions, secrecy, and choices that left ripples across 2 continents. For the American Lindbergh children, the revelation of 7 more siblings across the ocean was devastating. They had grown up under intense public scrutiny, carrying the burden of the Lindbergh name and the heartbreak of the infamous kidnapping. Now they were forced to reimagine their father, not only as a public hero, but as a man who had deliberately hidden parts of himself from them. Reeve Lindbergh, one of his daughters, wrote candidly about the pain of this discovery, how it felt like losing him a second time, realizing that the father she thought she knew was even more elusive than she imagined. For the European children, however, the news was a bittersweet liberation. At last, their secret had a voice. For decades, they had lived in the shadows, forbidden to speak openly of the man who occasionally appeared in their lives with tenderness, yet always with distance. Now the world finally knew the truth. Some, like Astrid, found relief in breaking the silence, while others chose to retreat, preferring the quiet anonymity they had fought so hard to preserve. Together, these children's stories reflect the duality of Lindbergh's legacy. On one side there is triumph, a man who expanded the limits of human possibility and inspired millions. On the other there is tragedy, a father who fractured his own family in pursuit of a private life no one was ever meant to see. His children carry both sides of that legacy, his brilliance and his distance, his vision and his secrecy. And what of Charles Lindbergh himself? To some, he will always be the daring aviator, the man who braved the impossible skies. To others, he is the controversial figure who praised aspects of Nazi Germany, who fought against America's involvement in World War II, and who retreated into secrecy rather than face the world openly. But perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between. Lindbergh was neither saint nor villain. He was human, a man capable of awe-inspiring courage, yet also of choices that left deep scars on those closest to him. Today, his legacy lives not just in history books or museum exhibits, but in his living descendants. His 11 children, spread across America and Europe, are the most enduring reminder of the complicated man behind the myth. Some live publicly, some privately, but all of them bear the weight of a name that changed history and shaped their lives in ways they never chose. In the end, the story of Charles Lindbergh's 11 children is not only about one man's secret, it is about the cost of greatness, the burden of secrecy, and the human truth that even legends are flawed. His triumphs in the sky will forever be remembered, but perhaps his greatest legacy is not the flight of the spirit of St. Louis, nor the fame that followed, but the human lives he left behind, lives bound together by love, by silence, and by the enduring question of who Charles Lindbergh really was.